Oh, it's a pleasure to talk with your students about all these important matters and all the books that they're reading. Introduce them to Leo Strauss's way of understanding the Republic, Aristotle's Politics, and some of the other significant work you're doing. It's a pleasure for me, and thank you for the opportunity to do it.
No, you're welcome. I mean, the students were obviously very interested in what you guys had to say. I thought they asked excellent questions. And, the panel conveyed to them why it's important to know about Leo Strauss, to absorb the lessons of Leo Strauss, to apply those lessons to reading great books.
Yeah, I can't imagine another university where a lecture on Strauss would be attended by almost every single student.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
That's a good thing, too.
In a good way.
Shortly, I'm going to hand over to Professor Priyu, and he's going to introduce the three distinguished gentlemen behind us on stage, one of whom you should know very well already, two of whom who have actually taught here before, this time last year in the symposium on Leo Strauss. And I'd like to, right from the very beginning, offer a very warm welcome to all of the students who've gathered from around the United States and further afield to come to UATX this week and learn about the thought of Leo Strauss in our second annual symposium. So could you give them a warm welcome to UATX? I'll mention briefly that Strauss is a very important thinker in our institution. His work, his school of thought is something that's been very influential for a number of the faculty that have joined us to teach here in this academic year. And we were delighted that the symposium last year was the very first class that took place on this campus when we opened the doors here, of course, before our current undergraduate class arrived. Professor Priyu.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're gathered here tonight for the first talk of our second term. And we're going to have a conversation on the thought of the German-American political philosopher Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was infamous for, among other things, always focusing on the central item in any list that he saw, any list of examples. You'll note that since we're on the trimester system, this is the second of three first of the term talks. It's therefore the most important, right? This is actually the second of three symposia on Leo Strauss. Second of three. This symposium serves to introduce students who have come from around the country, some from outside the country, to study with some of the most distinguished experts on the thought of Strauss. Tonight's conversation aims to introduce our larger community of undergraduates to who he was and to the significance of his work more generally. Allow me now to introduce our visiting faculty in particular. Mark Blitz, to my right, is Fletcher Jones Professor of Political Philosophy and Director of the Henry Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom at Claremont McKenna College. He served during the Reagan administration as Associate Director of the United States Information Agency and as a senior professional staff member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Senate Committee, not the Semitic Committee. He has also been vice president of the Hudson Institute and has taught political theory at Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Blitz is the author of numerous books and articles, too many for me to list, but most recently the excellent book, Reason and Politics, The Nature of Political Phenomena, published in 2021 by Notre Dame. Christopher Nadon, to my left, is Associate Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College and is currently teaching at Emmett Classical Academy in New York City. Professor Nadon completed his BA, MA, and PhD at the University of Chicago. They just couldn't get rid of him, graduating from the Committee on Social Thought. He has previously taught at the University of Chicago, the University of Kiev, and Trinity College in Connecticut. He is the author of Xenophon's Prince, Republic and Empire in the Cyropaideia, and most relevantly, he is the translator of Daniel Tanguay's Leo Strauss, An Intellectual Biography. Most recently, Professor Nadon has written on academic freedom and liberal education for the Wall Street Journal and for the Manhattan Institute's City Journal. Their conversation will be moderated by our beloved Dean Howland, who is rightfully seated in the middle. Without further ado, I turn things over to Dean Howland, please.
Well, thank you, Alex, for that introduction. As Alex said, the point of tonight's event is to allow students to form some idea of who Leo Strauss was and why his thought is important and why he's someone worth studying. And I'd like to begin with a general question about Leo Strauss. Who was Leo Strauss? Maybe we could have a brief overview of his life and intellectual development. Whom did he study with? Where did he teach? And why were so many brilliant minds attracted to Leo Strauss? And maybe also, who were his most illustrious students? I think I'm going to begin with Chris Nadon, and then we'll ask Mark Blitz to speak on the subject as well.
Well, he was a German Jew born in a small town who did quite well in gymnasium. I think at the age of 18 or 16, there's a letter from him saying that that time in his life he just sort of wanted to sit around, read the great books, and raise rabbits. And this was a joke because the word for rabbits in Greek is logos, not logos. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe rabbits are also not kosher. So Leo Strauss was, from an early age, a little bit off the reservation in pretty much everything. I'll let Mark want to talk about his education and his teachers.
And rabbits are not that hard to raise.
Yeah, that's important. He was not very attentive to farming.
Yeah. So, Strauss studied in Germany, the German structure, and his interest was philosophy and the German structures that you could move around to various universities. He studied with a great founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. He studied some of the great social scientists, Max Weber, but also sat in on some seminars taught by Martin Heidegger, the most significant thinker in Germany at the time. Among other students of Heidegger, and in a way, students who followed Heidegger more seriously, Hannah Arendt would be prominent among them as a name one would know. Strauss also was a significant student of Jewish affairs, and his first real position was in the institute which dealt with such matters in Germany. For all the obvious reasons, he left Germany because of the Nazis, came to the US, had a position at the New School for Social Research in New York City, which was the place where German emigre scholars found a position. In time, at the very end of the 1940s, he had a position as a distinguished professor at the University of Chicago, and that's really where his greatest influence as a teacher was. Among his students, Stanley Rosen, Alan Bloom, Seth Benedetti, Harvey Mansfield, and then some of their progeny and the progeny of their progeny. One could say that he's the single most influential student of political philosophy in our century.
Well, thanks. I also want to note that he wrote a dissertation under Ernst Cassirer. He studied with Edmund Husserl as well as Martin Heidegger. He knew Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin and was friends with Karl Löwith, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Franz Rosenzweig, and Carl Schmitt. I'm sure many of you don't know who all of these people are, but this is a kind of list of European intellectual luminaries. Let me fold the last part of my question into the next question, which is, well, just to remind you of the last part of my question, I was interested in why brilliant minds were attracted to him and who his best known students were, and Professor Blitz has already mentioned a few of them. But I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Mark, about how Strauss figures in your own intellectual genealogy. I'm particularly interested in who your teachers were, just briefly, and whether they were students of Strauss or simply influenced by him. And maybe you can say something about, why people who were, from a very early age, recognized as extremely intelligent and philosophically enthusiastic were drawn to Strauss?
Well, Strauss was a great teacher of political philosophy, but in a certain sense, even more significantly than that, his understanding of political philosophy, and therefore his understanding of philosophy more broadly, was not the narrow discipline that it's now become. So that if one really had an interest, or if you became inspired to have an interest in the deepest philosophical questions, as well as the deepest questions of human life, what is happiness? What is the best form of government? What is justice? Strauss attracted extremely intelligent students interested in those questions. And that, I think, is quite fundamental in his importance. Strauss also was able to unlock the real meaning and significance of the great books. So that if you opened Plato's Apology, if you opened Plato's Republic, if you opened Aristotle's Ethics, if you opened Aristotle's Politics, you saw things through Strauss's reading and interpretation that you were highly unlikely to have seen on your own, and things which were true and powerful. In my own case, I was introduced to Strauss by Harvey Mansfield. I was an undergraduate at Harvard. He was at that time an assistant professor at Harvard. He did not take his PhD at Chicago with Strauss, but was very much influenced by Strauss's work on Edmund Burke, the very last section of Natural Right and History. He himself wrote his dissertation on Edmund Burke. And he met Strauss and took a kind of informal seminar with Strauss when Harvey was at University of California at Berkeley, and when Strauss spent a year at Stanford. So that was his direct educational experience of Strauss. But through him, I had an interest in political philosophy, and then through Harvey Mansfield, had an interest in Strauss. My sophomore year, I went to the library and took out Natural Right and History. Didn't understand very much of it, but knew enough to see what a fundamental work it was. So that was my introduction.
Chris?
Yeah, my own introduction was a little bit different. I was introduced to Strauss on the mean streets of Chicago. Well, maybe not on the mean streets of Chicago, but on the somewhat quieter streets of Hyde Park. Well, maybe not even on the streets of Hyde Park, but I think somewhere in the Regenstein Library is where I came across Strauss. Strauss was not a well-known name at the time. This was in 1984, 85. Strauss died in 1972. I was only 10 years old. I had no direct connection to him. But I did, just by complete chance almost, happen into a class that was being taught by Alan Bloom on Plato's Republic. As a student at the university, and this was my junior year, as a student at the University of Chicago, I of course read the Republic in several different classes my first year. I'd been there, done that. A friend of mine, well, you should just stop in on the class, maybe you want to register for it. I did, and I was just entranced by Bloom from the beginning. Or not by Bloom, but by Bloom's reading of the Republic. He just began, and I think he gave an hour-and-a-half lecture on about the first 3 sentences of the Republic, unpacking it in a way that I'd never seen a teacher do before. And I had this wonderful experience of, smart-ass college kid, I already read the Republic. I'm like, did I read the Republic my first year, those 3 times? I hadn't. And it was this wonderful experience of being shown something that I had myself missed, which is a terrific educational experience because it's at the same time humiliating in a good way, because it's also enthralling, because you now see it, and it makes you reflect on your own shortcomings of not having seen it before. And it induces in you, I think, a kind of curiosity, like, if I miss this, what else have I been missing? So I ended up in Bloom's class, and I took a number of classes with him. Bloom himself was a student of Strauss, and I think a rather close student of his for the most part. He never encouraged and never mentioned, for the most part, or talked to his students about Leo Strauss, certainly not undergraduates. And I think I was a graduate student, maybe in my second year, and I was talking to him, and I mentioned something that I must have read in Strauss. And he said, "Oh, you've been reading Strauss?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." He says, "Oh, well, that's good." And then I asked him, "Why don't you ever tell students to read Strauss?" I was sort of slow. It took me a couple of years to figure out that this is what I should be doing. And he said, "Well, you know, if they have half a brain, they'll find it themselves." And so he thought that the best introduction to Strauss, in a way, was no introduction to Strauss. Or the best introduction to Strauss was actually to first read the books that Strauss wrote about. Because then when you read Strauss, you would have this wonderful experience of, wow, I didn't really read it, did I? And it's Strauss as that kind of encourager and teacher of close reading that was very powerful as an undergraduate for me.
I just want to mention that Harvey Mansfield of Harvard and Alan Bloom were famously excellent teachers and attracted wonderful students as well. I also studied with a student of Leo Strauss named Stanley Rosen. And I think it's important to mention this because, you know, it's one thing to pick up a book by somebody and read that book. It's another thing to study with that individual, or in this case, to study with the students of that individual, being Leo Strauss in this case. Of course, there's yet another generation of students of Leo Strauss, students of Leo Strauss, which you're seeing on the stage here, and I guess there are students of students of students of Leo Strauss now, so we've got many generations. But there is a living component to this. Maybe I should mention, I studied with Stanley Rosen at Penn State. When I was an undergraduate, in my freshman year, I wandered into a class taught by a man named David Lochterman, whom many people, well, anybody who ever met this guy, basically they all agreed that this is the most brilliant man that they ever knew. And I had an opportunity to choose between Yale University for my PhD and Pennsylvania State University. And Lochterman said, "Well, do you want, you know, a highly esteemed credential, or do you want to learn philosophy?" And so I decided to go to Penn State. But what I'm trying to show there is that really excellent teachers are attracted to excellent teachers, and they have excellent students. And I think that's extremely important. Rosen, by the way, published something like 14 books and 150 articles on subjects that were rather, in some senses, you know, distant from Strauss's own interests, like metaphysics, epistemology. Rosen published a book called The Limits of Analysis, and books on literary theory and political philosophy and rhetoric. Let me move now to the substance of, I think, the main substance of this evening's discussion. And the question I want to ask now is, I want to ask our two guests, when did you first encounter the thought of Leo Strauss? I think you already mentioned that, by the way. In fact, let me just mention here, I also encountered the thought of Leo Strauss by studying Plato's Republic with Stanley Rosen in my first year in grad school, so that's a rather interesting coincidence. But more important, how does Strauss's thought bear on your own work? And perhaps you might mention some essential insights of Strauss's that have informed your thinking. So, Mark.
Sure, I wrote my PhD dissertation on one of Plato's dialogues called The Statesman, one of the three political dialogues, the Republic, the Laws, the Statesman. Statesman, I think, is the one that's still least read and least studied. Needless to say, it's a wonderful dialogue. And my purpose in writing my dissertation on The Statesman was simply to learn how to read a dialogue carefully, or to try to do for myself as much as I could what one learns through Strauss about the way in which one should read a dialogue. So, though obviously in all the studies of political philosophy I was engaged in as an undergraduate, I looked in a way that always, in a sense, had Strauss in mind. It wasn't until I really myself completely went through a dialogue with no one else's help as much as possible that I really came to see the power of Strauss's analysis and way of thinking. The first book that I wrote was on Martin Heidegger. I'm one of the few people whose first book has nothing to do with his PhD thesis. That's not something that I would advise, by the way, from a career point of view. But the reason I did what I did is because I wanted truly to learn how to read a Platonic dialogue, truly to learn how to read a serious book. Well, it was clear when you looked at Strauss that he understood Heidegger to be the most significant and important thinker of the 20th century, but not only that, to be at the heart of the most fundamental challenge to political philosophy, what broadly one thinks of as historicism, connected to a certain kind of relativism, which opposes the notion that one could have a rational understanding of what is essential and true fundamentally and universally about fundamental matters such as justice and what is good. So I looked at Heidegger because I understood Heidegger to be the greatest challenge to the kind of thinking in which I was engaged. And I was turned in that direction by Strauss as well.
I should mention here, and I'm sure both of our guests know this, I read, and I think it was in an article in Interpretation, Strauss said that he had studied with all these luminaries, and I mentioned a bunch of them, Husserl and people like this, Cassirer. He said, I studied with the best minds in Europe, and the only comparison I can make between Martin Heidegger and all of these other thinkers is there was no comparison. Heidegger was that superior. And then he said, of course, Heidegger was a Nazi. And I leave you with this little puzzle. And therein, Strauss says, lies the problem of modernity. Chris.
Yeah, well, I did not come to Strauss through Heidegger, although I suppose Heidegger eventually through Strauss to some extent. But I ended up writing a dissertation on Xenophon. And of course, nobody would have written much of anything on Xenophon in the past century of any worth if it hadn't been for Strauss. Strauss sort of single-handedly recovered Xenophon as a thinker worthy of study. A lot of you, I don't know if anybody here knows who Xenophon is, but he was another student of Socrates, and up until 200 years ago was considered on the same level as Plato and Aristotle. Milton calls him Plato's equal. If you read Machiavelli's Prince, you might notice the only book Machiavelli recommends to read for the busy executive, right? So it's not a long list in the Prince. In fact, it's just one. It says, read Xenophon's Life of Cyrus. And in a way, that's how I got interested. I wrote a dissertation, an interpretation of the education of Cyrus. But I didn't do that. I had this interest in Strauss that antedated my decision to work on Xenophon. But I think part of the reason I was interested in Xenophon was part of the attraction of Strauss is that Strauss was highly unorthodox, and he was not in good odor in the academy. He was, by the time he left the academy, he was, he was considered to be a conservative in some ways, a reactionary by some others, but strange views. He had a good reputation in the 40s and 50s, but the more radical some sort of Strauss's works became, the more people sort of held him at a distance. And this was true for his students as well. And by the time I showed up and started reading this stuff, Strauss was just not to be really talked about in polite society. So when I hear today that I'm on the stage of a school where Strauss is an important figure at a university, it's astonishing to me that this could have happened in a way, because this was certainly not the case at the University of Chicago. At the University of Chicago, where he taught when I was there in the 80s, it was kind of a source of embarrassment that Leo Strauss had studied there. And whereas I said I encountered Strauss in the library, I had friends who would read Strauss in the coffee shop, but I had one friend who was also always looking to try to get a date. So he would read Strauss, but he had Xeroxed a copy of Heidegger's Being in Time, and he would put that over Strauss's over Strauss's book, so that he'd still be able to maybe get a match. Well, this is back before swiping, right?
It's only,
So
it's only at the University of Chicago that being in time would be
exactly, right? Being in time.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's the way to get. That's the way to get a date. But let's just say gave you a big leg up if people didn't know that you were interested in Strauss. And so the other thing was also that Strauss was a master at recovering neglected or forgotten authors, and in a way, even Machiavelli, obviously not a forgotten or neglected author, but considered not really a philosophic figure. Strauss rehabilitated him as perhaps one of the most important figures, and he did the same thing for Xenophon. In fact, Strauss wrote more on Xenophon than any other author that he spilled ink on, and he didn't do that for professional advancement. And writing on Xenophon, as I sort of suspected and soon discovered, is not the road to intellectual advancement. I think Jake mentioned my first job was teaching at the University of Kiev, which is in 1993, if you graduate having written a dissertation under Alan Bloom on Xenophon, that's one of the very few universities in the world where you could get a job. So, but that was part of the charm of Strauss. It was almost, he was, before there were forbidden courses at the University of Austin, Strauss was a kind of forbidden author at that time, and that was attractive. And he was forbidden for good reason, because he really is, he's a conservative in some ways, but his conservatism is based on an incredible radicalism at its root. And I think that's very attractive, and was very attractive to young people.
Let's get into some of the substance of his thinking. You mentioned that Strauss was in bad odor. I think it's fair to say that the political science in the United States in, say, the 1950s, 60s, was kind of a technical affair. People would study electoral patterns and various things, and they approached the discipline as a way to try to find solutions to evident social problems. Strauss was not interested in solutions. He was interested in the permanent human questions, like what is the good life, right? What is the role? What are the sources of sort of decency and meaning in human existence? Why is nobility important? Why is judgment and prudence important? He was interested in the permanent questions or the permanent problems. And Strauss didn't think that those permanent questions and problems had permanent solutions, or necessarily even any solutions. Every generation has to contend with them. And another thing I just want to mention about him, and I'm sort of saying these things to try to encourage maybe each of you to talk about some of his central ideas here, and then we can pursue them further. He thought that we should approach great books with real reverence and humility. That if you're reading Plato, if a book is worth studying, so you're studying Plato, by the way, in your Alan Bloom translation, you have to, if you see something inconsistent and you sort of say, well, why would Plato say that? Don't reach for an explanation like, he forgot what he started writing. When he started writing the sentence, he forgot by the time he got to the end of it what he was talking about, or it's a mistake. You should read it in something, with something like the reverence and humility that a devout Christian would read the Bible. Not to say that Plato was a god, although he was regarded as divine after his death by people who loved Plato. But one should have maximum generosity in interpreting him. I want to just say one other thing, and then ask our guests to maybe point out a couple of other important ideas of Strauss. Professor Priu mentioned that Strauss liked things in the center, right? The things that are in the center of a book are really important. I've made a whole scholarly meal out of the fact that the so-called third wave of the Republic, which states that philosophers should be kings or kings should be philosophers, is in the exact center of the text. In fact, coming back from a conference, it was honoring a man named Joseph Cropsey, who was a close friend of Strauss and worked with him. It occurred to me to actually study the Greek pages and figure out where the exact center of the text is, and it turns out to be basically 10 lines from the third wave. Another thing, though, and just to illustrate the importance of this, and then I'll shut up, if you read the Oedipus by Sophocles. At the exact center of the text is where Oedipus realizes, remember Oedipus has come and he's accidentally killed his father, which opens up a nice job of king of Thebes, and he slept with his mother. He realizes at the exact center of the play that, uh-oh, that old man that I killed there, could that have been my father? And so this is this sort of point where everything goes south, right? It's this point of reversal. And this is used by great authors, great literary figures. One I would mention is, how many people in this room have seen a film called The Lives of Others? Okay. It is one of the greatest films ever made. And it's about life in East Germany under the Stasi, the secret police. And I'm not going to tell you the plot, but at the exact center of the film is when the protagonist, who thinks that he's accomplishing something wonderful, is actually setting two of the people that he's most concerned about onto a downward path. So this is a moment where there's a kind of tragic turning point. And I would just recommend that if you're reading a book, any good book, ask yourself what the central chapter is. Ask yourself what the central lines are. And you might find some things very interesting. But let me see if, Chris, are there other elements of Strauss's thought, other ideas that are really fundamental?
I guess maybe the thing I've already said this today in the seminar, and you'll notice this about Straussians. I guess which all three of us would be called, even if we don't. And Straussian was a kind of term that very few people embraced on their own, but it was very quickly applied to us by others. and so, but if you've come to finally embrace it, you'll also discover that your fellow Straussians, they're a very contentious sort. Not least of all with each other. So first I'd like to say, I just hate that whole middle stuff. I mean, it's just like...
Okay.
and I don't hate it because it's not true, because it frequently is true. And once you actually study how Greek texts were made and the scrolls and how they were written and how, every scroll had more or less the same, it would have been super, like anyone publishing a Greek text like Plato in scrolls, it would have been super easy for them to actually just keep track of where the middles of all sorts of things are. So I'm not saying it's not true, but I still do say that I hate it.
One thing to say about the middle, though, there's a reason for it. And the reason is that most people pay attention to things at the beginning, and they pay a lot of attention to things at the end, but they don't pay much attention to what's going on in the middle. So the idea of putting something important in the middle is a way of attracting those who'll pay serious attention all the way through. That's the kind of notion behind it. Otherwise, it's not so easy to explain.
Or of course, you could put the weakest part in the middle to hide it from suspicion. I don't mean to imply that this was going on all the time, but but it is, yeah, and there are different strategies. And even in Xenophon, I regret to say, has a wonderful discussion of building a house and why you put certain things in the middle. And the same thing when you order an army, right? Why you put the old soldiers at the back, you put the good soldiers in the middle, and you put the not so good soldiers in the front, so the good soldiers can push them forward, right? And so there's sort of strategies involved and different rhetorical reasons why the middle is an important place. But still, just because something's in the middle, you still got to figure it out why it is actually important. But it really does sometimes help. So in any case, sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of other things. One thing, maybe the most surface kind of thing for those who studied political science, is the sense in which Strauss was one of those who argued against this overly technical, overly social scientific understanding of political things. He wasn't the only one. Hannah Arendt, Eric Voegelin, Michael Oakeshott, they're a group of important thinkers. But Strauss was certainly important among them. But really, the important things about Strauss went beyond that and centered on his studying so many fundamentally important thinkers and so many fundamentally important questions. That was the real attraction. What is justice? Can one have a reasonable understanding of justice? What, as I said, is happiness? What is the best way of life? These are the central questions, and he pointed you to the central authors who study those questions seriously. You also learned how to read a book. As was said, the central thing that you really need to know is that a significant and intelligent author, they are always completely in charge of their argument and their statements. So you read them as if everything in them makes sense. You read them as if everything in them is consistent. This may prove incorrect, may prove impossible. It may, as I've said, show one's own limitations and not being able to actually figure it out. But that's what serious reading is. Serious reading of serious people means to take them seriously, and you take them seriously by believing to begin with. Your hypothesis, one might say, to begin with, is that everything in that work is there for a reason and that the author is fully in control of those arguments. So you learn to read in a serious way. You learned what the important questions were. You learned that narrow ways of looking at important political and human matters generally were insufficient. And you learned that it was at least possible to open the question of permanent and guiding truths, difficult as that was. You put this all together and you can see why it's attractive to study with Strauss and those who studied with Strauss. You can also see why it wasn't always the most useful thing practically to study with Strauss, because in each one of those areas, you would make enemies.
Yeah, and look, I just wanted to say, the other wonderful thing about Strauss was just the intellectual courage of the man. And he wasn't exactly someone who reverenced old books. He wasn't an antiquarian. He didn't like the smell of books in the library the way some people do. You turn back to these books because he would show you really don't have a choice. And you don't have a choice because Strauss would take head on the most challenging questions of his day. One of the things I was very attracted to, of course, was the problem that has not gone away in the last 40 years, although it's not so much discussed anymore. This challenge of moral relativism to philosophy. It's kind of disappeared from discourse. That not because it's been solved, not because it's been resolved or dismissed. Strauss took it head on. What his particular answers are and challenges to it is debatable. And does he overcome moral relativism? But at least he took it seriously, and he indicated and sent you to these old books as possible resources for thinking about it in a different way that might be more that might be more not just satisfactory, but that actually would be more powerful and insightful. So he always turns you to look at books not exactly with reverence, but also as things that could be used. Or as my teacher Alan Bloom said, he liked to encourage people to read Plato's Republic, and this reference might be lost on your particular generation, but he would said, as if it were the manual for their new hi-fi stereo. This was back when hi-fi stereos were very complicated to set up, and you really did need to read the manual to get good use out of it. It wasn't just plug and play. But that was the kind of, like, books could actually be useful for you, for your life, and could actually inform you, not as an educated person, but maybe give you answers to problems that we all face as human beings, and particularly the intellectual problems that we're all challenged with in late modernity.
Let's talk about late modernity. How does Strauss shed light on our current social and political realities? Like, why is he relevant to us today as late moderns?
Well, it doesn't matter what the period of time is. The fundamental questions, the fundamental issues, and the fundamental guidelines for understanding political affairs, for understanding human affairs, for understanding human virtue, for understanding human excellence, those guidelines don't change. So the first step is always to think about those matters seriously and to pay attention to them seriously. And that's why the substance of not just Strauss, but the people Strauss encourages you to read, why that substance is so significant. That's, I think, really the first question and the first point. The second is to have some understanding, which I think carries throughout many, if not all, of Strauss's writings, some understanding of the limits of what one can achieve politically. Utopias are not possible. One needs to protect the ability to think, to talk, to speak. One needs to look seriously at the alternatives. One needs to recognize the alternatives. That's a second point. So if you think hard about the most serious and significant issues, that's your central guideline for dealing with contemporary affairs. I was in government. I've served in government politically. And that's really what's significant. Where are you going? What are you trying to achieve? What's the significant goal and direction? If you know that, you'll be able to figure out what it is you should be doing here and now, short term and midterm. If you don't know where you're going and why you're going there, it doesn't matter how clever you are about setting up the stereo if you don't know what the good music is that you should be putting on it.
So again, the good. Chris.
Yeah, I think for us today, Strauss was very concerned with moral relativism, mostly as an intellectual challenge, I think, because it seemed to be a very powerful challenge to philosophy. And if you're really interested in philosophy, you're also interested in powerful challenges to philosophy because it keeps you on your toes. So that was part of it. But I think he was also, having lived in Germany in the 1930s, he saw something in America that this kind of easygoing moral relativism or nihilism with a happy face, as people sometimes describe it, that it was not sustainable. And he always wanted to remind people of that. And of course, if it was just sort of ignored or swept under the rug, it was likely ultimately to issue in a kind of fanatical backlash, the likes of which you saw after the Weimar Republic. And so he very much was in favor of trying to find grounds for countering that kind of severe backlash and finding a certain kind of grounds for moderation in politics. But of course, the wonderful thing is he seems to have found those grounds in a kind of philosophic radicalism, which would combine the two, and how practical conservatism issues from that kind of radicalism, I think, is part of what's really interesting and useful in Strauss, particularly for young people, because what young person is actually really attracted to, or what philosophically serious person is really attracted to philosophic moderation? Or in other words, Strauss kind of makes you realize philosophic moderation is a kind of oxymoron. Although political immoderation, he understood to be a real cause of human harm. And how to connect political moderation to philosophic radicalism, I think is one of the most useful things for us today, why we might want to turn to Strauss.
Just following up on that, Strauss is a fan of moderation, political moderation. And he associated that with the ancients. The moderns, by the way, we moderns are impatient. We have exhibited since the French Revolution a longing for total revolution. Our immoderation comes out in these crazy schemes to lead us to a utopia where we get communism and fascism and all these isms that lead to totalitarianism. We think that history is going somewhere. And as Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize-winning poet of the Soviet Union, said, when you get to the end of history, you get to concentration camps and gas chambers. That's been the experience of the 20th century. And we must never forget that. Strauss was a fan of not big schemes. By the way, Aristophanes, he wrote a book on Aristophanes. I know we're going to have a number of students reading Lysistrata, which is a wonderful play of Aristophanes. But Aristophanes also wrote a book called The Assemblywoman, where absolute communism was established. And so this is a very old problem. And Strauss understood that we need to moderate our political passions. And he also balanced political passions, thumatic, spirited passions, against erotic philosophical longing for truth and goodness and beauty, which is very much at the core of UATX. And so he was interested in the problem of the relationship between philosophy and politics, which can be expressed in Plato's Apology, right? What happens to the philosopher who meddles in politics? He's executed. There's also an analogy to that, by the way, in regimes like the Soviet Union. Anybody who thought for himself, opened his mouth, spoke his mind, was not long for the world. Let's wrap this up with just one more question so we can have the students ask questions. Our students this term are studying Herodotus, Thucydides, some of Aristotle's Politics, Plato's Republic. They're also reading Exodus. What insights from Strauss might guide our students in their readings? And if students want to study Strauss, what should they begin with?
You should begin with Herodotus, the Republic, and Exodus, and study those first yourself on your own. Strauss's student Alan Bloom did a translation of Plato's Republic. He wrote a long interpretive essay as well, which he put at the end of the book. And I remember sitting in his class, he said at the beginning of class, don't read my interpretive essay. Read the book first. Struggle with the book first. And come to it on your own terms, come to your own conclusions, and then turn to the interpretive essay, then turn to Strauss in a certain sense for help. But to go back to what Jake was just saying, the one thing, I mean, he does, the one nice thing about Strauss, and it's peculiar about him, is he always think that the author's your superior. In a way, the only way that you're ever going to master a text is to first become its slave. And in a way, enslave yourself not to what you think about the text, but always try to figure out what is it that the author is really thinking here. And it's a wonderful way to travel in the sense of to get away from yourself and to get away from the usual way that you're used to looking at things and that your society is used to looking at things. But if you can do that, submit to the text, ultimately it actually can lead to a mastery. And of course, the interesting thing is, I think, as Mark said, part of the reason he wanted to study the statesman was to master a text. And the thing is, if you can master one difficult text, you can do it to another. It's a transferable skill to a large extent. It'll be different, and you can't apply the same rules or methods. There is no rule or method for reading books. But you should always, in a certain sense, approach them with the spirit of humility, which first encourages you to be a slave, but always remember your servitude is in the service, ultimately, of your mastery.
There's nothing much to add to that. You read these books as if they have something to teach you, and you try to understand them as much as you can. One thing, though, I ought to say, one doesn't and shouldn't, I think, leave the impression that Strauss's understanding of political philosophy so completely separates philosophy and politics. Strauss and his students organized various seminars that looked at fairly particular political matters. Some of the students of his students went into politics. It's very important, I think, always, but perhaps especially in our age, that people are politically active who understand the real meaning of equal natural rights, the real meaning of freedom, the real meaning of virtue, the real meaning of excellence, and what one needs to defend. So the political world is not the home of thought as such, but nonetheless, it's significantly important that certain people bring to the political world a serious understanding of serious matters.
Amen. Well, let's thank our speakers, and we can turn to questions.
Hi. So since Alan Bloom was a student of Strauss, do you worry that his translation of the Republic over-highlights what Strauss saw in the Republic?
Now, he's the student of Bloom, though I knew Bloom well, so he should do the answering.
I think the thing to worry about in a translation is whether it's faithful to the original text. And I think as far as my Greek is adequate for studying things, but it's not outstanding, so I can't really speak to that. But there's always a possibility that a translator is going to inject himself and his own interpretation into any translation. And I don't think, I've actually gone through Bloom's translation pretty carefully, and others just seeing, looking for better and worse ones. And there are other good translations besides Bloom. But I just personally, I don't think Bloom. I think Bloom is very faithful to the Greek, and that's what you want in a translator, and consistent. That's and you know, and a literal translation, the kind that Bloom produces, that's not fanatically literal, that sort of tries to use the same keywords, translate them similarly all the same time. All the time in the translation. I think that's an extremely helpful thing to do. But of course, you're absolutely right. Who's to say what a key word is and what isn't a key word, right? That's going to involve some choice on the part of the interpreter. So I think I would say what I think Harvey Mansfield has a wonderful line at the beginning of his translation of Machiavelli's Prince. If you think this is a bad translation, do a better one. If you think it's a good translation, learn Italian. And so I say to you, learn Greek.
And Italian also.
And Italian. No, but studying languages, which is so hard to do in today's world for an English speaker. Where can you go to immerse yourself in a non-English place? It's very, very difficult. But if you have a motive to learn to read, if you really want to read a book in a different language, that can be an incredible spur to learning that language. And of course, learning another language, that's like, opens up a whole nother world. You're a different person when you learn another language. I mean, thinking takes place in the medium of language. And if you change your language, that's a whole nother world in some ways of thinking.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm curious, what are some examples of how Strauss's interpretations of these texts differs from maybe more conventional ones?
Well, Strauss would never, many conventional interpretations, when they run across a difficulty, try to explain that difficulty in terms of the time in which the author was writing, try to explain that difficulty in terms of the common opinion of people of that time. And Strauss never did that, so that when you look seriously at the thought of someone, you don't reduce those kinds of arguments in any direction. That's one thing to say. One of the sections in Natural Right and History that we looked at together concerns John Locke. A typical of an interpretation, and in fact the dominant interpretation at that time, was to have a certain view of Locke's relation to and dependence on a traditional religious or Christian natural law thinking. Strauss had a radically opposed view, where that was not what was dominant. A dominant interpretation of that time of John Locke was that John Locke was a great opponent of Thomas Hobbes. Strauss's interpretation is that Locke is fundamentally a follower of Thomas Hobbes. So you'll find that in many areas, but that maybe is the most visibly striking place where Strauss quite clearly and explicitly really differentiates himself from other interpretations.
Well, actually, there's another one that's even more clear and explicit, which might be up your alley since you guys are reading Plato's Republic. Strauss doesn't think Plato believes in the Platonic ideals. Like, try that on at the American Political Philosophy Society, and you're going to find yourself shoot to the exits pretty quickly. So that's a very radical position of Strauss that separates him very much from standard issue interpreters of Plato.
I'd like to add one other thing about that. Up until fairly recently, and it was Strauss's influence, although nobody really acknowledged it, readers of Plato were inclined to look at Plato's production as philosophy, okay? And we know what philosophy is. Philosophy is arguments. And there was a kind of school of analytical philosophy. So they'd read the Republic and they'd say, what's important about the Republic? Sort of conceptual, distinctions, and this is what the ideas are, and here's his argument for being, and so forth. The fact is that the closest literary analog to Plato's dialogues is Greek tragedy and comedy, okay? Greek drama. So why is it that he wrote dialogues? Why are these characters? Why is this argument in the mouth of Glaucon? Why is this argument in the mouth of Thrasymachus? Now, if you're going to begin to answer these things, you will begin to notice that, for example, there are tics and habits of speech that there are certain characteristic gestures that these interlocutors make. And you start to realize this person is really a literary genius, and somewhere in the neighborhood of somebody like Shakespeare when you get into it. And you also start to realize that to understand a document like the Republic, you've got to understand Greek drama, Greek history, Greek rhetoric, Greek political theory, because the Greeks are always competing with each other. And they're in this competition for wisdom. And the poets think wisdom is this, and the philosophers think it's this. And maybe the politicians have some other goal. And once you start opening that up, you begin to understand things not in the context that's reductive that I think Mark was talking about, right? Like, oh, Plato thought this because he was a product of this time. No, you begin to understand the deeper sense in which he's a product of his time. That is, he's interacting with all of these other thinkers in a very, very exciting, vibrant era. And then you can begin to dig these things out. So reading carefully, thinking carefully, and noticing all elements of the text. Now, by the way, the analytic philosophers are writing books saying, look at the literary dimension. We've discovered the literary dimensions are important. Anyway.
Let me give two other examples. Strauss takes Machiavelli much more seriously than I think anybody before. Machiavelli always understood to be an important political figure, always understood to be radical in some of his political views and judgment. Strauss understands Machiavelli as the founder of modern thought, makes him a much more comprehensive and deeper figure, really, I think, than anybody prior to him, at least in the academic world. And then one more example, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a famously inconsistent thinker. If one looks at the section on Rousseau in Natural Right and History, Strauss does really a brilliant job of working out all of Rousseau in a manner which makes his fundamental arguments consistent, again, making Rousseau a deeper figure in a way than others did. So in a certain sense, if you look at almost every figure that Strauss really grappled with seriously, something fundamentally different appears in his work from what one had seen before.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons Strauss might find a home here at UATX is because Strauss just pours acid on the distinctions between so-called academic disciplines.
Yeah.
And that's an incredibly liberating thing it's not just sort of shallow interdisciplinaryism, which can happen as well, but that these distinctions really melt in the face of sort of larger concerns about thinking and about rhetoric and about thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question. Thanks.
Professor Nadon, you brought up this interesting idea from Alan Bloom where he doesn't point people to Strauss. He sort of just lets them come to it, struggle to it on their own. And I was wondering that as society, it's more, there's so much more out there to consume, so many more distractions, other ways that are easier for us to become stimulated. Will there ever become a point where more is needed to make these, higher, great ideas accessible? And if so, how can that be done?
Yeah, well, thanks. First, thanks for not saying, so your teacher said, don't directly encourage people to read Strauss, so what are you doing right now? So thanks for not doing that, although you should have. But in a way, I think you answered you answer, if that were your charge, I think you answer it, is times have changed. We are living in a world where it is becoming harder and harder to be a reader. And because of that, the souls of our students are becoming flatter and flatter. The original title of Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, which he was very happy to change because and the publisher changed it, not him, because he says, well, if it had its original title, it wouldn't have sold, more than 5,000 copies. And so he was happy to take the royalties from the big sales. But the original title is the title that it has in its French translation, Souls Without Longing. Right? That's not going to be a bestseller, probably. Closing of the American Mind, yes. But we live in a world where there are these other both temptations, distractions, and challenges. And I think we as teachers have to do more and more actively to encourage the discipline of quiet reflection and study. And that's just changed circumstances and changed times. And if you have any suggestions on how this can best be done, I struggle with it all the time. Not just with my students in a certain sense, even with myself. It's these are frightening times. I'm just shocked at if you look at sort of. I'm teaching at a high school now. I have 10 students, 7 of whom have never. They're in 9th grade, have never read a book outside of school on their own. And that's a radically different world than the one I grew up in. And this is something that is just a pressing problem to which I don't have an answer. You?
Still working on it.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Is this a student?
Well, so long as students ask the question.
Always a student. Always a
Exactly.
student.
That's a trick question.
He's so well dressed for a student.
Well, they're doing all right.
Yeah, look at these guys.
But he also can't be faculty because he's so well dressed for faculty.
They're not doing too bad. No. I wonder, I think we have this right between the pincer, but I want to ask because it was the most revelationary thing to me about being introduced to Strauss thoughts, and I am by no stretch a Straussian. But I wonder if you can give an account of historicism. I know we have touched on it, but what is historicism? I think Peter Thiel has used the phrase, I'm sure many others have, the problem of historicism, and what is Strauss's answer to it? And maybe if we can go a little bit further, can there be a counter-critique of the answer that Strauss gives? I'm thinking of my own education at St. John's College when, the Straussians would come, with a way of reading and a way of answering this problem of historicism, and then be counter-accused of going too far and of being somehow unproductive. So what is historicism and what is Strauss's answer to it?
Well, the simplest sense of historicism is the view that everyone's thought, and everyone means the deepest thinkers as well, everyone's thought is relative to a particular time, and therefore can't be and isn't permanently true. That's the simplest sense of historicism. Then there are other more fundamental arguments about historicism, the philosopher Hegel, for example, where thoughts are relative to their time, but there is a completion, the so-called end of history, and therefore thoughts in a certain sense, though they were always relative, are no longer relative. Then the question is he correct or is he not correct? Then there's a return of a kind of deeper, you might say, historicism, where it's not just the time, but we're fated in all ways to see things only in a limited manner. Well, one's first reply to that is to make that way of thinking a problem, to ask what are its grounds, what are its roots, what's behind that argument. And once you've made it a problem and once you've challenged it, it's up for examination the same way everything else is up for examination. That's, I think, the first crucial matter. The next thing is to really make the positive arguments, not just counter to historicist arguments, but the positive arguments as far as one can go on the deep questions that one is engaged in. What is the human good? What is human justice? Speaking primarily of matters of politics and political philosophy. And then the next step is to try to understand why it is that there's always going to be something incomplete or imperfect in one's understanding, not necessarily because of the time in which one lives, though one needs to leave that open as a possibility, right? And not simply dogmatically close that, not because of that, but because of the fundamental way things are in relation to us. So that is what one needs to continue to do at a fundamental philosophical level. Speaking politically, one needs to, at a certain point, close things off. There are certain things one must act as if they are, within their proper limits, correct. Otherwise, one is swimming forever, going nowhere. And one is therefore often prone to closing things off in a radically irresponsible way. That's what I'd say.
I want to give you an anecdote that illustrates the difficulty, how the notion that history determines what we think really warps thought. So I was giving a talk at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark on Plato, and we were discussing something, and somebody asked me about some literary dimension of Plato, and I gave an answer. I said, well, he's doing this. And the student said, that's impossible because that hadn't been invented yet. Now, if you just think about this for a second, it's like, well, then how could it have been invented if a genius, if Plato couldn't invent it? So I said something like, well, Plato was a genius. And the whole class gasped. And as I was leaving, the talk, I asked my guide, my host, why did they all gasp? And he said, because they've been taught that there's no such thing as a great man or a genius. Everyone's equal, okay? So this illustrates, first of all, you can't conceive, you get into these weird paradoxes, nothing, if your thinking is bound by your time, then how does it change? And then the next thing was this illustration of how these young people's thinking was utterly bound by their time. They couldn't imagine that there was someone great or a genius or anything like this. These are the paradoxes you run into with historicism. It's very strange.
Yeah, or again, a practical thing to think about when you're reading the Republic. How did Socrates come up with the quality of men and women in 5th century BC? So that's just a kind of data point, which doesn't refute or not refute it, but how do you explain that?
Not just Socrates, but Aristophanes. So you have,
One of the core Straussian arguments for why reading great books is so important to addressing the permanent problems is that they were written by men of unparalleled or at least extraordinary genius. From a Bayesian perspective, shouldn't we be skeptical of that, given that there are so many more people living today and presumably so many more geniuses?
Well, society might not simply determine necessarily what we think, but it has a big influence. And there can be better and worse societies for the production of thoughtfulness. And one thing I think that becomes clear when you study the history of political philosophy is there are few worse things for intellectual excellence than political stability. You look at an interesting, provocative, quote-unquote, timeless philosopher, scratch them, and you will almost find them always living in times of civil war, religious war, incredible political turmoil. And so those conditions are what produce interesting thinking. And absent those conditions, you wouldn't expect in a Bayesian world, right, to get the same outcome.
Just as a follow-up on that, maybe that can explain a lack of good philosophy production today. But if we're talking about, say, 1910 to 1990, a period that saw lots of revolutions, wars, and we compare that to, say, the 5th century, where you had the Peloponnesian War, you had a couple of other conflicts like that, you had coups, but generally speaking, they were both pretty conflict-laden. Why is it that, according to the Straussian idea, the 5th century BC had so much more great philosophy production, despite having so many fewer people than the period 1910 to 1990?
I don't know, 1910 to there's Heidegger, there's Strauss. Those were some pretty productive years.
It isn't really the case that you only have great thought in times of stress and difficulty. You have that often, but Hegel, Kant, even Nietzsche. I mean, if you want to call all of that a period of great stress, then everything is always a period of great stress. So it's not actually necessary. There's something to be said, however, for the fact that serious thought produces serious thought, and serious teachers and thinkers attract serious teachers and thinkers. So a Socrates is likely to attract a Plato if there's a potential Plato. A Plato is likely to attract a potential Aristotle if there's a potential Aristotle. So there's certainly a way in which strong things attract other strong things as well. And if you put that together with a respect for strength, intellectual strength, then I think you have a somewhat greater chance of producing something excellent. It's also the case that there may be superb thinking which has decided not to publish, not to write, to stay silent and to stay quiet. So I'd say all of those things, yeah.
And Strauss is always open. He's not I'm just stuck on old books. What does he say? Bhutan, 2025. That could be the place where the next great thinker emerges. Burma. Or Burma, excuse me, yeah, Burma, one of those Asian bees. Sorry.
There is no longer a Burma, however.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Dan.
I'm interested in how you actually define a master of a great book. Like, who's to say Strauss is a master of Plato's Symposium when I got like a C+ on my essay on the symposium? Or do I need to write a book or get a PhD, or how do you weigh who is
I'll help you out. The Symposium is the first work of Plato I read seriously with Harvey Mansfield. And it was clear to me reading that work that there were things in that work that I simply had not noticed, that I simply had not seen. Not that I'd gotten wrong, but I simply had not seen. It became clear to me that it was possible to put all of those things together in a consistent way and learn something fundamental about the fundamental topics of the symposium. So it's not so much a question of who is to say, it's a question fundamentally of being honest with yourself, of recognizing that you truly don't understand something that you're pretending to understand, of recognizing that you've gotten tired, as it were, that you've rested where you shouldn't rest, and having failed to push all the way. Obviously, it's important what other people say, so you would like them to raise that C+ just a little bit, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more. But fundamentally, you have to have your own understanding of whether you've really and truly grasped what you think you've grasped.
So I don't need the credentials.
Well, it's not a bad thing, but it's not the central thing. The central thing is yourself and your own soul and your own understanding. That's what has to be central.
You don't need the credentials. And I think, as we pointed out today, Strauss, for quite a number of years, was given a gentleman's C-, which of course doesn't prove that that was what he deserved. And of course, the very fact that today he's coming back in vogue doesn't necessarily prove that he now gets a B+ or something. It's always, you have to go to the text and judge it yourself. But in a certain sense, as an interpreter of another book, one of the tests is, can you explain, how much of the book can you explain without explaining it away? How can you really put it together in a certain sense? You know, can you put the pieces together in an interesting way, resolve apparent contradictions and show they're not real contradictions? Those are sort of tests that I think help us see whether or not it's not just, you know, if I tell you Hamlet, right? What's it about? I think it's about a fisherman's wife who can't get pregnant. Good, is it? Yes. So, I mean, yeah, that's not even a C-, right? Like, okay, do you agree with, is that just, not all interpretations are equal, right? That's just a terrible interpretation. Like, I don't think even really, I mean, something's fishy in Denmark or smell, but you know, like, I don't think it's a fisherman's wife or anything like that, but, right? It's just a horrible interpretation, right? So not all interpretations clearly are equal, which doesn't mean that it's easy to judge at the heights.
Great, thank you.
Do you guys ever worry that when you're completely submitting yourselves to these texts, that the revelations you gain with all this hard work really have nothing to do with the texts nor the authors themselves, and that you could gain the same, I guess, transcendence from reading a student paper or something spit out by ChatGPT the exact same way?
Well, I haven't seen a student paper or something produced by ChatGPT that produces those kinds of insights. I'm not ruling it out completely. But I do think, look, I mean, maybe this follows up with what Chris was saying, you know, what are you gaining from this? And some books, maybe not much. But however, you know, you might reread them later, 10 years, 20 years. I think the sign of a great book is that is that it makes you think, and it draws you in a way that makes you want more from it. And that's why you go back to it. And maybe even that more might be, I had so much pleasure, I'm going to reread this thing. But, the question of well, is this objectively in the book? That's not particularly important, because if you read the thing and you say, wow, my soul has expanded, or my mind has expanded in some way. Now I'm thinking about things differently, and I can start to understand things that I haven't quite understood before. Then it's been meaningful reading the book. And by the way, I'm not a snob about books. My ignorance is vast. So if you bring me a book, I'm not going to look at it and say, oh, well, this isn't a great book because I don't know who the author is, or what did you get out of the book? And then, incidentally, if you do get something important out of a book, you want to tell people about it too. So you go and you talk to them, and that's sort of another test, right? Like maybe you find out that your thinking that this is a wonderful text is not so great, because somebody points out, well, if you're really interested in that, read this, or this is just a repeat of that, or something like that. But I don't think it's, part of your question was sort of like, how do we know that that's what the author was thinking? I think that was part of your question, right? Or did the author put that in the book?
I was saying, do you worry that it has nothing to do with the author or the text whatsoever, and that it could be anything as long as you put that much effort into it?
I don't think that I think you can put equal amounts of effort into vastly different things and get vastly different outcomes. And, reading Aristophanes or something like that is going to give you more insight than reading some cheap romance book that you buy because you're in the line at the supermarket, and
Even if you read it like you would read Aristophanes.
Yeah, because it's not very good.
Yeah, the key, what's important is it's not just the books, it's what the books are about. It's the phenomena that they're trying to discuss. We mentioned Plato's Symposium, whose topic is love. So thinking through the symposium is a way to truly understand, or seek to understand, all of the dimensions of that powerful phenomenon. Thinking about the Republic, a way to try to understand all the dimensions of that phenomenon. That's what's crucial. And if you're thinking about the phenomenon together with the book, you'll see whether or not the book has really opened your eyes to things that you would not have seen otherwise, opened you beyond where you were beginning. That's really what's fundamentally crucial. It's not the books themselves as totemic objects, or the names of authors as totemic objects. It's using them as a way of truly understanding the fundamental things you seek to understand.
Thanks.
Or let me just add, sometimes the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Thank you. I was wondering, what does it mean to be serious, and what does it mean to be strong? So for example, when we talk about serious people talking about serious things, what does serious mean? And when we talk about being intellectually strong or strong-minded, what does strong mean?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, the serious thing, I think, is this passion to understand, and the willingness to take into your soul, if I can use that word, what it is that you're learning. The strong part, I think, is perhaps connected with seriousness, because once you have formed a kind of core set of ideas that maybe even integrate your personality, that are central to you, then to live by them and not be afraid to assert them. Now this connects with virtues, right? Like courage. And so, we could discuss examples of people who do have a wholesome, integrated personality, if you will, whose lives have a directionality and a set of what we might call core values, right? That are in their inner being, and whose speeches and deeds and comportment live up to those things. I mean, one way to look at Socrates, right, is so you have these ideas, if you will, like the idea of justice or idea of courage, is that Socrates lives up to what he understands about justice, right? So he's serious about justice. I want to grasp it. And the living up part is, displaying that seriousness through a kind of strength. I'm not going to say, oh, I have these views about justice, but whenever issues of justice arise, I just consider what my own advantage is. Anyway, that's a beginning to the answer.
I guess I would just suggest, but not very seriously, that the only way to be serious is to not think you're the most important thing, to not take yourself too seriously. You have to take yourself seriously, but if you take yourself as the most serious thing, that's completely frivolous. And in terms of strength, I'll just say it's following an argument all the way to its end, regardless where it goes.
So I'll just say, serious is, you start with really the most pressing question, which is, how should I live? What should I do with my life? And to really examine that and not take for granted any of the half answers or dream answers or things thrown your way, to really seek to understand and see what might be the proper direction, generally speaking, and then for yourself. And strength means, in this case, no lies, no lie in the soul, no lie to yourself, right?
Well, thank you. I think we've reached the end of our, Alex, bring us home.
So I think it's fitting that we ended on a Socratic question. What is seriousness and what is strength? And I'll just add that if you're interested in those things, you should go read Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, which are very much about the serious and the strong man. Please join me in thanking our guests and Professor Allen.